Samuel Brooks had imagined this week 100 different ways. In every version, he sat quietly in the audience, applauding just a little longer than everyone else as his son accepted the highest honor of his career. He never pictured himself on the stage. He never wanted recognition. Watching from the crowd would have been enough. 3 days before the ceremony, that picture disappeared with a single vibration from his old phone. The message came from his son, Daniel. Samuel smiled before opening it. He assumed it would be another reminder about the schedule or parking, maybe a joke about arriving early because his father always insisted on leaving an hour ahead of time. Instead, he read 11 words that refused to make sense. Please don't tell anyone you're my father. He stared at the screen. Then he read it again and again. The words never changed. The kitchen seemed strangely quiet. Even the old clock on the wall, which usually filled the room with its steady ticking, felt impossibly distant. Samuel slowly lowered himself into the wooden chair beside the table. His reading glasses slipped lower on his nose, but he didn't adjust them. The phone remained in his hand for nearly a minute. He didn't blink, not because he was crying, because his mind couldn't find a place to put what he had just read. He whispered the sentence aloud, as though hearing it might reveal a meaning the screen had hidden. Don't tell anyone you're my father. The words sounded even colder spoken into an empty room. 3 days. Only 3 days remained until the ceremony. The whole town had been talking about for weeks. Neighbors had congratulated him at the grocery store. His former co-workers had shaken his hand, telling him how proud they were that one of their own had raised such a successful man. Samuel had smiled every time, not because he believed Daniel's success belonged to him, but because every parent quietly celebrates when a child reaches farther than they ever could. Now that pride sat on the kitchen table beside a message he couldn't understand, his thumb drifted toward the call button. He stopped. Maybe there was another message coming. Maybe Daniel had sent it by mistake. Maybe someone else had meant to receive it. He waited. Nothing. The silence stretched until it felt heavier than the words themselves. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A dog barked. Life continued with complete indifference. Inside the little house, however, something invisible had broken. Samuel finally opened the conversation and typed a reply. Son, did I do something wrong? He looked at the sentence for several seconds. Then he erased it. He tried again. I'm sorry if I've embarrassed you. Delete. Another attempt. Let's talk. Delete. The empty message box stared back at him. For the first time since Daniel had become a little boy, Samuel realized he had no idea what words a father was supposed to use when his own son seemed ashamed to claim him. He set the phone face down and rested both hands on the table. Across the room stood a neatly pressed navy suit, still hanging in its garment bag. He had picked it up 2 weeks earlier. It wasn't expensive, just something respectable enough, he thought, for the biggest day of his son's life. His eyes lingered on it only a moment before he quietly looked away. He still didn't know whether he had misunderstood the message, or whether, in 3 days, the proudest moment of his son's life would become the hardest moment of his own. Samuel didn't sleep much that night. Not because he kept reading the message. He didn't. After placing the phone on the kitchen table, he never picked it up again. Somehow, seeing those words once had been enough. His memory repeated them with far more precision than the screen ever could. Before sunrise, he followed the same routine he had kept for years. Coffee, 2 slices of toast, the small radio playing softly in the background. Routine had always been his way of telling life that no hardship was bigger than the next sunrise. This morning, however, every familiar habit felt as though it belonged to someone else. His eyes wandered toward the garment bag hanging near the front door. He had bought the suit after visiting for different stores, not because he cared about fashion, because he wanted Daniel to look into the audience and see a father who had made an effort. Samuel smiled faintly, remembering how awkward he'd felt standing under bright dressing room lights while a young salesman adjusted the sleeves. You celebrating something special? The salesman had asked. My son is receiving the biggest award of his career. The words had come out with a pride too large to hide. The salesman grinned. Then we better make sure you look just as proud. Samuel had laughed. Now the suit seemed strangely out of place, hanging silently beside the door like a promise waiting to discover whether it still belonged to anyone. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Helen, the neighbor who had lived across the street for nearly 20 years. She stood on the porch holding a small peach pie. I baked too much again, she said with a smile that fooled neither of them. Thought I'd let you help me solve the problem. Samuel welcomed her inside. Helen glanced toward the garment bag almost immediately. So, she said, setting the pie on the counter, 3 more days. Samuel nodded. You must be excited. I am. The answer came so naturally that even he almost believed it. Helen laughed warmly. I still remember Daniel riding that little blue bicycle up and down this street. Who would have imagined he'd end up where he is now? Samuel's face softened. He always wanted to go farther than the sidewalk. I remember, she said. You spent weeks running behind that bicycle. Samuel chuckled quietly. He kept telling me to let go. And did you? Only after I knew he could balance on his own. For a brief moment, both of them smiled at the memory. Then Helen noticed the phone lying untouched on the table. You hear from him today? Samuel's fingers tightened almost invisibly around his coffee mug. He sent me a message yesterday. Oh. He must be busy getting everything ready. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Helen accepted the answer without questioning it. She began talking about the ceremony, about how the whole neighborhood felt proud watching one of their own succeed. Samuel listened politely, answering when necessary. Yet every compliment landed with unexpected weight. Each kind word reminded him of the sentence he hadn't shared with anyone. When Helen finally stood to leave, she paused at the front door. Your wife would have been so proud to see this week. Samuel looked toward the family photograph resting on the bookshelf. His late wife smiled from the frame exactly as she had 25 years earlier, one hand resting gently on young Daniel's shoulder. She would have loved every second of it, he said quietly. After Helen left, the house fell silent again. Samuel walked over to the photograph, not to relive the past, but because one thought refused to leave him. If Margaret was still here, would Daniel have sent that message at all? The question settled into the quiet room without an answer, and for the first time, Samuel wondered whether this painful request had begun only 3 days before the ceremony, or years earlier, when his son slowly started becoming someone his own father no longer recognized. Samuel stood before the family photograph for a long time. Margaret's smile hadn't changed in 15 years. Some mornings, he still caught himself expecting to hear her humming in the kitchen before remembering the silence belonged to the house now. He gently lifted the frame from the shelf, not because he wanted to escape into the past, because there had once been someone with whom he could carry every difficult decision. Now every burden seemed to arrive addressed to one person. He brushed an invisible speck of dust from the glass. You always knew what to say, he murmured with a faint smile. I never did. His voice disappeared into the empty room. The photograph offered no answers, only memories, not the grand ones people usually tell after someone is gone, the ordinary ones. Margaret sitting at the dining table late at night, mending Daniel's school uniform because buying another one wasn't in the budget, laughing when Samuel tried to help and somehow made the stitching worse, promising each other that one day Daniel's life would be easier than theirs. Those promises had become the rhythm of their marriage. After Margaret died, Samuel kept making them alone. The memories ended when the shrill ring of the telephone broke the silence. It was Frank. They had worked together at the factory for nearly 30 years before retiring within months of each other. Sam, Frank's familiar voice boomed. You getting ready for the big weekend? Samuel smiled despite himself. I'm getting there. I told my grandson about Daniel. Said I worked beside the toughest man in the county. You remember those double shifts back in '98? Samuel laughed softly. I remember trying to stay awake driving home. You weren't doing it for yourself. No, you were saving for Daniel's college. Samuel leaned against the kitchen counter. Most people remembered promotions or vacations. Frank remembered overtime. I still can't believe the kid made it this far, Frank continued. Your sacrifices paid off. Samuel looked through the window toward the quiet street. They were never sacrifices to me. Frank chuckled. Only a father would say something like that. The words settled gently, then became unexpectedly painful. Because somewhere, somehow, Daniel no longer seemed to believe them. You coming to the ceremony? Frank asked. Samuel hesitated. Only for a second. I haven't decided. You? Not decided? Frank laughed. I'd have to drag you away from that front row. Samuel forced a smile Frank couldn't see. We'll see. After they hung up, Samuel remained standing with the silent receiver in his hand. He hadn't intended to avoid the question. The answer had simply refused to come. Later that afternoon, he walked into the spare bedroom. The closet held old boxes stacked neatly against the wall. He searched for winter blankets, but one worn cardboard box slipped from the shelf and landed on the floor. Its lid fell open. Inside were dozens of school projects, construction paper, Father's Day cards, spelling tests, drawings made with thick crayons. Samuel smiled as he picked one up. A stick figure with oversized shoulders stood beside a much smaller child holding his hand. Across the top, written in uneven pencil, were the words, "My dad is my hero because he works hard every day." In the corner, Daniel had added one more sentence. When I grow up, I want to be just like him. Samuel closed his eyes, not because the memory hurt, because it was impossible to place those innocent words beside the message sitting on his phone. Children don't wake up ashamed of their parents. Something changes along the way. He carefully returned the drawing to the box exactly where he had found it. For the first time, his thoughts drifted away from his own pain and toward a different question. What had happened in Daniel's life that transformed pride into embarrassment? The answer wasn't waiting inside the old house. It was somewhere in the world his son had built, a world Samuel had never truly seen. Daniel Brooks had spent years building a life that looked effortless. From the outside, it seemed like the perfect success story. Corner office, national recognition, magazine interviews, a leadership award that would place him among the most respected executives in the country. People admired his confidence. Few noticed how carefully it had been constructed. 3 days before the ceremony, the headquarters buzzed with excitement. Employees crossed the lobby carrying floral arrangements and presentation folders. The communications team hurried between conference rooms, rehearsing introductions and checking every detail for the televised event. Daniel barely noticed any of it. He stood inside his glass office, staring at the city below. His assistant, Rachel, stepped in holding a folder. The event organizers confirmed everything, she said. Your speech is scheduled right after the chairman's introduction. Daniel nodded. They're also asking if any family members will be sitting in the reserved section. He answered without turning around. No. Rachel looked up from her notes. No family. I'm attending alone. She hesitated only a moment. They said they could still add someone if you'd like. It's fine. She smiled politely and left. The door clicked shut. Daniel exhaled slowly. It should have felt like relief. Instead, the office seemed unusually quiet. His eyes drifted toward a framed photograph on a bookshelf. It had been taken 5 years earlier during another corporate event. He stood beside senior executives, all wearing tailored suits and effortless smiles. There wasn't a single picture of his family anywhere in the office. That hadn't happened by accident. Years ago, he had started telling pieces of his story differently. He spoke about earning scholarships, about long nights studying, about determination. Everything he said was true. He simply stopped mentioning where he came from. The small factory town, the modest house, the father who spent decades working overtime in steel-toed boots. Each omission felt insignificant when it happened. Together, they became a different identity. His phone vibrated. A message from a colleague appeared. Big weekend. Can't wait to meet the people who inspired you. Daniel stared at the screen. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. Finally, he typed. Maybe another time. He deleted the message. Instead, he replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. It was easier, much easier. A knock interrupted him. Come in. It was Michael, the executive who had mentored him since his first promotion. You've earned this, Michael said warmly. Enjoy it. I'll try. Michael smiled. You know what I remember most about my award ceremony? Daniel shook his head. My father, sitting in the front row. Daniel forced a smile. He wasn't impressed by the cameras. Afterward, he told me my tie was crooked. Both men laughed. My dad never understood business, Michael continued, but somehow seeing him there mattered more than the trophy. The laughter faded. Daniel felt something tighten inside him. Michael noticed the reserved seating chart lying on the desk. You left the family section empty? Daniel answered carefully. My father's not comfortable with events like this. Michael nodded without suspicion. I understand. But Daniel didn't. Because that wasn't the truth. Samuel had never been uncomfortable standing beside his son. The uncomfortable one had been Daniel. Not because of anything Samuel had done. Because Daniel had become terrified that the people whose respect he wanted would see the life he had spent years trying to leave behind. That afternoon, as he walked through another rehearsal, applause echoed through the empty ballroom. Everyone else heard celebration. Daniel heard expectation. For the first time since sending the message, a question slipped into his thoughts quiet enough to ignore, but impossible to silence completely. If hiding his father was the right decision, why did every step towards success suddenly feel so much heavier? The next morning, Samuel woke with a decision he hadn't consciously made. He would go into town, not to buy anything, not to distract himself, just to keep moving. He had learned long ago that grief grew heavier when a man sat still too long. After locking the front door, he slipped the invitation into the inside pocket of his jacket almost out of habit. It had become part of him these past few weeks, folded and unfolded so often that its edges were beginning to soften. Main Street looked exactly as it always had. Mrs. Dalton arranged flowers outside her shop. The hardware store owner swept yesterday's dust from the sidewalk. Two children raced bicycles past the bakery, laughing as though nothing in the world could ever become complicated. Samuel smiled at them. For a brief second, he saw another little boy wobbling down this same street on a blue bicycle, shouting, "Don't let go yet." The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. "Sam." He turned to find Frank stepping out of the coffee shop, waving him over. "I was hoping I'd run into you." The two old friends settled at a table near the window. Frank poured coffee into Samuel's cup before filling his own. "You nervous about the ceremony?" Frank asked. Samuel gave a quiet laugh. "I don't know if fathers get nervous." "Oh, they do." Frank leaned back in his chair. "My daughter's nursing graduation nearly finished me. She walked across that stage, and I cried before she even got her diploma." Samuel smiled. "I probably would have done the same." Frank studied him for a moment. "You're quieter than usual. Just thinking." "About Daniel?" Samuel nodded. Frank stirred his coffee slowly. "You know, we all watched that kid grow up." Samuel looked up. "Every overtime shift you took, everybody knew why. I wasn't the only father working hard." "No," Frank agreed, "but you were the one who never complained." Samuel looked down at his weathered hands. The scars across his knuckles had faded over the years, but they never completely disappeared. Steel didn't forget the men who shaped it. Neither did time. "You ever regret it?" Frank asked softly. "The overtime? The years you gave?" Samuel answered without hesitation. "Not for 1 minute." Frank smiled. "I knew you'd say that." The conversation drifted to old factory stories, retired co-workers, and how quickly grandchildren seem to grow. For nearly an hour, Samuel almost felt like himself again. Then, as they walked outside, they passed the display window of a men's clothing store. A navy suit stood on a mannequin beneath the sign that read, "Celebrate life's big moments." Frank nudged him with a grin. "Looks like somebody copied your style." Samuel forced a smile. "I suppose they did." But after Frank left, he remained standing before the window. His own reflection stared back at him. Grey hair, worn hands, kind eyes that looked more tired than they had a week ago. He suddenly imagined walking into the award ballroom wearing his carefully pressed suit. Would anyone see a proud father? Or would they see exactly what Daniel feared they would? The thought unsettled him. Not because he believed it, because for the first time, he wondered whether his son truly did. As Samuel stood alone on the sidewalk, miles away, Daniel sat inside another strategy meeting where executives discussed seating arrangements, media interviews, and post-ceremony photographs. Someone casually asked, "Your father must be excited." Daniel answered with a practiced smile, "I'm sure he is." The meeting continued. No one noticed the answer had cost him something. Across two different worlds, father and son spent the same afternoon pretending everything was normal. Neither of them spoke the truth. Yet with every hour that passed, silence was no longer protecting either man. It was quietly becoming the hardest choice either of them had ever made. 2 days remained before the ceremony. Samuel crossed the date of the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. He paused longer than usual. The square marked Saturday was circled in blue ink, just as it had been for nearly a month. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, he'd written only 3 words: Daniel's big day. He reached for the pen again. For a moment, he considered crossing out the words. Instead, he quietly returned the pen to the counter. The day hadn't changed. Only his place in it had. A soft knock came at the front door. When Samuel opened it, he found a young delivery driver holding a long cardboard box. "Package for Samuel Brooks." Samuel frowned. "I wasn't expecting anything." The driver smiled. "Looks like it was ordered a couple of weeks ago." Samuel signed the receipt and carried the box inside. He opened it carefully. Nestled in crisp white paper was a polished pair of black dress shoes. He remembered immediately. He had ordered them after buying the suit. His old shoes had served him for nearly 15 years, but the soles had begun to separate. He had laughed to himself while placing the order. Up to Daniel's biggest day, looking like my shoes survived a war. Now they looked almost too perfect. He lifted one from the box. The leather reflected the morning light. Without thinking, he sat down and slipped it on. It fit perfectly. He stood and took a few slow steps across the kitchen floor. The shoes felt unfamiliar. Not because they were new, because they belonged to a future he was no longer certain existed. He removed them just as carefully as he'd put them on and placed them back into the box. Not hidden, not displayed, simply waiting. Across the city, Daniel was preparing for a different kind of fitting. A tailor adjusted the sleeve of his tuxedo while another employee pinned the cuff into place. "There," the tailor said with satisfaction. "Perfect." Daniel studied himself in the mirror. Everything looked exactly right. The jacket fit flawlessly. The tie sat straight. Every detail reflected the image he had spent years creating. Yet something felt strangely incomplete. His phone buzzed. Rachel stepped into the fitting room doorway. The event coordinator sent over the final seating chart. She handed him a tablet. The front row displayed reserved name cards. Board members, sponsors, industry leaders, mentors. One chair remained blank. Rachel noticed it too. They're still asking whether you'd like us to assign that last seat. Daniel looked away. No, she hesitated. You sure? Most recipients invite someone important. I've already made my decision. Rachel nodded politely and left. Daniel continued staring at the empty space on the screen long after she was gone. He realized something unsettling. He had worked so hard to control every detail of the ceremony. Yet one empty chair now demanded more of his attention than every honored guest combined. That evening, Samuel wandered into the garage looking for a flashlight. Instead, his eyes landed on an old wooden toolbox. Daniel had made it in 7th grade shop class. The corners weren't perfectly square. One hinge had always squeaked. On the bottom, burned into the wood with uneven lettering, were the initials, GB. Samuel smiled. He opened it. Inside were a few forgotten nails, a measuring tape, and a folded piece of notebook paper. Curious, he unfolded it. It was a list written in a boy's handwriting. Things Dad taught me. Ride a bike. Shake hands firmly. Tell the truth. Finish what you start. Keep your word. Samuel read the list twice. His fingers rested on the last line. Keep your word. A quiet breath escaped him. Some lessons, he thought, don't disappear. They simply get buried beneath louder voices. He carefully folded the paper exactly as he'd found it and placed it back inside the toolbox. As he switched off the garage light, one thought followed him into the darkness. If Daniel had once believed those lessons enough to write them down, what voice had become powerful enough to make him forget them? The answer was drawing closer, and so was the day that would test both men far more than any award ever could. One day remained. Samuel didn't trust the date of the calendar. He simply looked at it for a long moment before turning away. Tomorrow. For weeks, that word had carried excitement. Now it carried a choice. The house felt unusually still, so he decided to do something he had been postponing since spring. He walked into the backyard. The small garden Margaret had loved was beginning to lose its shape. Weeds had slipped between the flowers, and the climbing roses had wandered beyond the old wooden trellis. She never let them grow wild. Samuel rolled up his sleeves and began working, pulling weeds, straightening loose stones, tying back the vines. The work was slow, but familiar. For the first time in days, his thoughts weren't racing ahead to tomorrow. They stayed with his hands. An hour later, Helen leaned over the fence. I thought I'd find you here. Samuel smiled. The roses were getting ahead of me. They always listened better to Margaret. They did. Helen opened the gate and stepped inside, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed him one. You've barely talked about tomorrow. Samuel looked toward the garden instead of answering. I've noticed. He took a sip before speaking. Do you remember the year Daniel won the 8th grade science fair? Helen laughed. He marched the trophy around the neighborhood for 2 weeks. He insisted on sleeping with it beside his bed. I remember. Samuel smiled at the memory. He told everyone his mother helped him think, and I helped him build. Helen's smile softened. He was proud of both of you. The sentence lingered between them. Not painful, just impossibly distant. After a quiet moment, Helen spoke again. You know, children don't always realize what their parents carry. Samuel nodded. No, but most of them figure it out eventually. He looked at her. You sound very certain. My oldest didn't speak to me for nearly 4 years. Samuel blinked. I never knew that. I didn't tell many people. She looked down at the glass in her hands. We were both stubborn. I thought time would fix everything. Did it? No. What did? Helen smiled faintly. One phone call where neither of us tried to win. Samuel let those words settle. Neither of us tried to win. That wasn't what this was about. At least, he hoped it wasn't. When Helen left, she paused at the gate. Whatever tomorrow brings, she searched for the right words. Don't let one painful moment rewrite your whole life. After she was gone, Samuel remained in the garden. He looked around. The flowers stood a little straighter now. Margaret would have noticed. He smiled quietly. I finally got them right, he whispered. Across the city, tomorrow had become an endless checklist. Daniel moved from rehearsal to interview preparation to a final run-through of his acceptance speech. The ballroom was nearly finished. Technicians adjusted lights. Cameras tested angles. Rows of polished chairs stretched toward the stage. Daniel walked through them alone. He stopped at the reserved front row. His name stood centered before the stage. Beside it, the chair remained empty. No name card, no reservation, just empty space. The event coordinator approached. We still have time if you'd like us to add someone. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the chair. Finally, he said, "Leave it." "As you wish." She walked away. Daniel sat down in his own reserved seat and looked toward the stage where, tomorrow night, everyone would applaud him. He imagined delivering his speech. He imagined shaking hands. He imagined holding the award. For years, that picture had been complete. Now every version ended the same way. One chair, one empty space, one absence he had created himself. He reached for his phone. Samuel's contact appeared on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button. Seconds passed. Then someone called his name from across the ballroom. "Daniel, they're ready for the final rehearsal." He locked the phone without making the call. As he walked toward the stage, he couldn't shake the feeling that every step bringing him closer to the greatest achievement of his life was also carrying him farther from the man who had made that achievement possible. The morning of the ceremony arrived without ceremony of its own. No fanfare, no excitement, only the quiet light of dawn slipping through Samuel's kitchen window, touching the invitation that still rested on the table. He had been awake for over an hour. The coffee had grown cold before he remembered to drink it. Today, neighbors would expect him to leave wearing the navy suit. Today, Daniel would step onto a stage he had spent decades climbing toward. Today, two lives that had always moved together would quietly separate. Samuel unfolded the invitation one last time. His name wasn't printed anywhere on it. Guests were welcome. Family was expected. He traced the embossed lettering with his thumb before carefully folding it again. Then he walked to the closet. The garment bag hung exactly where he'd left it. He unzipped it slowly. The navy suit looked as crisp as the day he'd brought it home. Beside it sat the polished dress shoes, still inside their box. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Then, with calm, deliberate movements, he lifted the suit from its hanger. He carried it into the bedroom, laid it neatly across the bed, placed the shoes on the floor beneath it. Anyone walking into the room would have assumed he was getting ready. Instead, Samuel reached into the dresser and took out a faded denim shirt and his old work jeans. He folded the suit carefully, returned it to the garment bag, closed the zipper. There was no anger in the motion, no bitterness, only acceptance. He looked at his reflection in the bedroom mirror. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. Years ago, when Daniel had left for college, Samuel had hugged him outside the bus station. "You don't owe me success," he'd said. "Just become a man you can respect." This morning, Samuel realized something he hadn't understood back then. Those words had always applied to both of them. He couldn't choose the man Daniel became. He could still choose the man he would remain. Across the city, the ballroom had come alive. Guests filled the entrance hall. Cameras flashed. Conversations blended into the elegant music drifting through the chandeliers. Daniel stood backstage while an assistant adjusted the microphone clip to his jacket. "Nervous?" she asked. "A little." "Good." She smiled. "It means it matters." She hurried away before he could answer. Did it? The award mattered. The recognition mattered. But beneath all the excitement, another question had begun pressing harder against his thoughts. What if the one person whose opinion had mattered long before promotions and headlines wasn't here to see any of it? He slipped his phone from his pocket. No new messages. Not from Samuel. Not from anyone mentioning Samuel. Nothing. The silence that had once felt convenient now felt impossible to explain. Back in the small town, Samuel drove without a destination. The roads were familiar. Past the elementary school where he'd first walked Daniel to kindergarten. Past the baseball field where he'd spent countless Saturday mornings cheering louder than anyone else. Past the bus stop where he had waved until the bus disappeared, even after Daniel was old enough to be embarrassed by it. He smiled sadly at that last memory. Back then, embarrassment had been innocent. A boy wanting independence, not a man wanting distance. His truck eventually rolled into a quiet lakeside park. He switched off the engine. The water barely moved. A few ducks drifted lazily across the surface. On another bench nearby, an elderly couple shared a sandwich, laughing over something neither of them seemed in a hurry to finish. Samuel watched them for a moment. Then his phone vibrated. His heart stumbled. He reached for it almost immediately. The screen lit up. Not Daniel. A community reminder about road construction. He stared at it, locked the phone, set it beside him. For the first time since receiving that heartbreaking message, he admitted something to himself. He had already decided not to attend, but somewhere deep inside, he had never stopped hoping his son would ask him to come. Miles away, the announcer's voice echoed through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program will begin shortly." Guests settled into their chairs. Executives greeted one another. The front row slowly filled. Daniel stepped toward the aisle, almost without thinking. His eyes searched the audience. One section, then another, then the front row. Every reserved seat was occupied, except one. The empty chair didn't surprise him. It accused him, and for the first time since sending 11 unforgettable words, Daniel wasn't wondering whether his father would appear. He was wondering whether he had already lost something no award could ever replace. The applause began before Daniel heard his own name. It rolled across the ballroom in warm, confident waves as each recipient was introduced, each success celebrated, each achievement met with smiling faces and standing ovations. From backstage, it sounded exactly as he had imagined for years. When he finally stepped into the light, hundreds of people rose to their feet. The cameras followed him. The host extended a hand. "Congratulations, Daniel Brooks." "Thank you." His smile looked natural. His handshake was steady. No one watching would have guessed that his eyes had already drifted beyond the stage, toward the front row, toward the empty chair, several miles away. Samuel sat on the weathered bench beside the lake. The ceremony had begun. He knew it without looking at the time. For years, he'd imagined exactly where he would be at this moment, near the front, leaning forward slightly, hands folded until Daniel's name was called, then applauding harder than anyone else in the room. Instead, only the breeze disturbed the quiet afternoon. A little boy chased ducks along the shoreline while his father followed a few steps behind, pretending not to notice the child deliberately slowing down so he wouldn't be left alone. Samuel watched them with a gentle smile. The father finally caught up. "Thought you wanted to race," he teased. "I did." "Then why'd you stop?" The boy shrugged. "I wanted to make sure you were still there." The father laughed and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm always here." They walked away together. Samuel lowered his eyes. Sometimes children needed to know their parents were behind them. Sometimes, parents simply hoped their children still knew. Inside the ballroom, the chairman began reading Daniel's accomplishments. Years of innovation, leadership, integrity, service. Each sentence was followed by applause. Daniel listened without really hearing. His thoughts wandered elsewhere, to another pair of hands. Rough hands, scarred hands, hands that had lifted heavy steel beams, repaired broken bicycles, tied crooked neckties before school dances, and quietly applauded every small success long before anyone else knew his name. He suddenly realized something unsettling. Not one achievement being celebrated tonight had happened alone. Yet the man who had made the first opportunities possible wasn't there to witness the last one. The applause grew louder as the chairman concluded, and for his outstanding leadership and lifelong commitment to excellence, the audience stood once again. Daniel accepted the Crystal Award. It was heavier than he'd expected, cold against his palms. Beautiful, perfectly polished, completely silent. Samuel reached into the pocket of his jacket. The invitation was still there. He unfolded it carefully, not to change his mind, just to see it one last time. His gaze settled on the event's motto printed beneath the program title, "Honoring those who inspire excellence." A faint smile crossed his face. "They got that part right," he whispered. He folded the invitation again and slipped it back into his pocket, not as something he had lost, as something he no longer needed to prove. For the first time since receiving Daniel's message, the weight inside his chest eased. The hurt remained, but it no longer defined him. He had spent decades believing fatherhood was measured by milestones, graduations, first jobs, promotions, awards. Now, sitting beside a quiet lake with no audience at all, he understood something Margaret would have recognized long before he did. The greatest part of being a parent wasn't standing beside your child's victories. It was loving them even when your own heart wasn't invited. Back at the ceremony, the master of ceremony stepped toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, our recipient would now like to share a few words." Daniel walked slowly to the podium. The ballroom fell completely silent. He unfolded the speech he had revised for weeks. Every sentence had been polished, every pause rehearsed. He looked down at the first line, then toward the empty chair. The carefully prepared words suddenly felt unfamiliar. For the first time in his professional life, Daniel wasn't afraid of speaking before hundreds of strangers. He was afraid of the one person who wasn't there to hear him. He looked at the speech in his hands and quietly lowered it to the podium. Daniel rested both hands on the podium. The speech he had practiced for weeks lay untouched before him. The ballroom waited. So did the cameras. "So much for rehearsing," he said with a faint, uneasy smile. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the audience. It gave him a few seconds to breathe. He looked down once more at the pages. Then he folded them in half. "I've spent a long time thinking about what success looks like." His voice was steady. "Tonight, everyone has been kind enough to list my accomplishments." He glanced toward the Crystal Award resting beside the microphone. I'm grateful for every opportunity I've been given. The audience listened attentively. But standing here, he paused. I'm realizing there are parts of my story I haven't talked about very much. Across the room, Michael looked up with quiet curiosity. Daniel continued. I've often told people about scholarships, long nights, mentors, hard work. All true. But the beginning of the story came much earlier. His eyes drifted once again to the empty chair. It began in a small house where there was always enough love, even when there wasn't always enough money. The ballroom grew still. My father worked in a factory for most of his life. Daniel swallowed. He believed that if he worked one more shift, one more weekend, one more holiday, maybe my future would become a little easier than his present. He stopped speaking. The words caught somewhere between his throat and his heart. No one moved. No one interrupted. I don't think I ever thanked him the way he deserved. The sentence left his mouth almost as a confession. He wasn't looking at the audience anymore. He was looking at the empty chair, the one he himself had left empty. Michael slowly lowered his head. For the first time, he understood. Daniel took a careful breath. My father taught me to keep my word. A memory flashed through his mind. A rough wooden toolbox. A handwritten list. 5 simple lessons. Ride a bike. Shake hands firmly. Tell the truth. Finish what you start. Keep your word. His chest tightened. Somewhere along the way, he had remembered the lessons and forgotten the man who taught them. I've spent years trying to earn respect. His voice softened, and somewhere in that pursuit, another pause. I confused respect with approval. The room remained silent, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. Daniel looked directly into the audience. If the people who loved us before success don't recognize the person success turns us into. He stopped. The sentence hurt too much to finish. His eyes glistened, but he never lost control. I accepted this award tonight. He rested one hand lightly on the trophy. But there's someone who deserved to witness this far more than I deserve to receive it. His gaze returned to the empty chair. It was supposed to be occupied. No explanation followed. None was needed. The audience had begun assembling the missing pieces on their own. Daniel understood something with painful clarity. His father hadn't embarrassed him. He had protected him. Samuel had honored the request without complaint, without argument, without forcing a painful scene. The silence Daniel had mistaken for acceptance had actually been an act of love wrapped in dignity. That realization struck harder than any public criticism ever could. The applause that followed was gentle, respectful, but Daniel barely heard it. The crystal award still rested in his hand. It had become the greatest achievement of his career. Yet standing beneath the brightest lights he had ever known, only one thought remained. When the ceremony ended, he wasn't going to celebrate. He was going to find his father, if it wasn't already too late. The applause continued after Daniel stepped away from the podium. People rose from their seats, some because they believed they had witnessed an unusually honest acceptance speech, others because they sensed there was a story they hadn't fully heard. Daniel heard almost none of it. The crystal award remained in his hand, but its weight no longer came from the glass. It came from everything it couldn't fix. As the program moved to its closing remarks, guests leaned toward one another in quiet conversation. That was powerful. I've never heard him speak like that. I wonder why his father isn't here. The question spread softly through the boardroom. No one knew the answer. Daniel did. And for the first time, he wished he didn't. When the ceremony officially ended, photographers hurried toward the recipients. Daniel, over here. One more picture. Congratulations. Flashes lit the room. He smiled out of habit. The expression disappeared the moment each photograph was taken. The event coordinator approached him. There's a reception in the grand hall. Everyone's waiting. Daniel looked toward the ballroom doors. I won't be staying. She blinked in surprise. The board members wanted to congratulate you personally. They can wait. He had never spoken those words before. For years, every meeting, every dinner, every networking opportunity had felt important. Tonight, none of them mattered. He handed the award to Rachel. Could you hold this for me? She accepted it carefully. Of course. Thank you. She watched him loosen his tie as he walked quickly toward the exit. Daniel, she called after him. He turned. I hope, whoever you're going to see. She smiled gently. They're still waiting. He nodded once. So do I. Nearly an hour away, Samuel was driving home as the evening sky turned shades of amber and blue. The lake had given him something he hadn't expected. Not happiness, but peace. The road was nearly empty. He drove with the windows cracked open, letting the cool air drift through the truck. When he reached the edge of town, he stopped at a small grocery store. His refrigerator was nearly empty. Life, after all, would continue tomorrow. Inside, he wandered slowly through the familiar aisles. Milk, bread, coffee, a can of tomato soup, ordinary things. The cashier smiled as she scanned his groceries. Big night tonight. Samuel looked up. It is. You must be so proud. His answer came after a brief pause. I've always been proud. She smiled without realizing how carefully he had chosen those words. Meanwhile, Daniel's car sped along the highway. The city lights faded behind him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His mind replayed the last 3 days with painful clarity. The message, the silence, the empty chair, his father's absence. He had expected the hardest part to be asking Samuel to stay away. He had been wrong. The hardest part was discovering that Samuel had loved him enough to honor the request, not because he agreed with it, because he refused to become the obstacle his son feared. Daniel finally understood what had happened. His father hadn't surrendered his dignity. He had protected it, and in doing so, he had protected Daniel from carrying the memory of publicly rejecting him. That realization left no room for excuses, only responsibility. Samuel carried the grocery bags into the house and placed them on the kitchen counter. The familiar silence greeted him once again. He unpacked everything slowly. When he finished, he noticed the garment bag still hanging beside the front door, untouched, waiting for a day that had already passed. He walked over to it, rested one hand against the fabric, then smiled softly. Not because the pain was gone, but because he knew something now that he hadn't known 3 days earlier. A son's rejection could wound his heart. It could never erase the life he had lived with love. Just then, headlights swept across the front window. A car pulled into the driveway. Samuel frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. The engine stopped. A car door opened. Footsteps crossed the porch. Then came a slow, uncertain knock. Samuel stood motionless. Somehow, before he reached the door, he already knew who was standing on the other side. Samuel didn't answer the knock immediately. Not because he was angry, because some moments deserve a heartbeat of silence before they change a life. Another gentle knock echoed through the house. Not impatient, not demanding, almost hopeful. Samuel walked to the front door. His hand rested on the doorknob. He took one quiet breath and turned it. Daniel stood on the porch. The tuxedo was still perfectly tailored, but everything else about him looked different. His tie hung slightly loose. His hair had been disturbed by the long drive. His eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that no lack of sleep could explain. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The porch light cast a warm circle around them while the rest of the street lay quiet beneath the evening sky. Daniel tried to smile. Daniel entered slowly, as though he no longer felt certain he belonged inside the home where he had grown up. Nothing had changed. The old clock still ticked above the doorway. Margaret's photograph still rested on the bookshelf. The same wooden dining table stood in the center of the kitchen. Time had moved forward. The house had remained faithful. Daniel's eyes wandered across the room until they stopped on the navy garment bag hanging beside the front door. His breathing caught. You bought a suit? Samuel followed his gaze. Yes. For tonight? Yes. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. He didn't ask the question. He already knew the answer. You were going to come? Samuel nodded once. I was. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they had avoided saying for 3 days. Daniel finally spoke. I watched the chair all night. Samuel said nothing. I kept hoping. Daniel swallowed. That maybe you'd change your mind. I almost did. Daniel looked up quickly. You did. Samuel nodded. This morning, hope flickered across Daniel's face. Then Samuel continued. But if I'd come after reading your message, he searched for words that would wound neither of them. I wouldn't have been there because you wanted your father. He looked gently into Daniel's eyes. I would have been there because I couldn't accept losing him. Daniel's shoulders sank. For the first time, he understood what Samuel had protected, not only his own dignity, their relationship. Had Samuel forced himself into that ballroom, every memory of the ceremony would have been tied to conflict. Instead, his absence had left room for truth. Daniel's voice barely rose above a whisper. I don't know when I started becoming that person. Samuel answered honestly. Neither do I. I told myself it was just business. Daniel laughed bitterly at himself. I thought people would judge where I came from. And would they have? I don't know anymore. Samuel looked toward the framed photograph of Margaret. When your mother and I were raising you. A gentle smile crossed his face. We never dreamed you'd become famous. Daniel listened quietly. We only hoped that wherever life took you. Samuel looked back at his son. You'd never feel the need to leave yourself behind. Those words settled into the room with quiet finality. Daniel's eyes filled, not with dramatic tears, with recognition. He realized the greatest distance he had created wasn't between himself and his father. It was between himself and the young boy who had once proudly written, My dad is my hero." For a long moment, neither man tried to fill the silence. Neither tried to win. Neither tried to defend the past. At last, Daniel took one hesitant step forward. Not enough to assume forgiveness, only enough to ask whether reconciliation was still possible. And Samuel, seeing not the executive the world admired, but the son who had finally stopped hiding from himself, waited not to hear another explanation, but to see what choice Daniel would make next. Daniel stood only a few feet away. It was the shortest distance between them in years, yet it felt like the longest journey either man had ever made. He looked around the kitchen once more. Nothing here had been designed to impress anyone. The cabinets were older now. The wallpaper had begun to fade near the window. Even the table carried small scratches from decades of family dinners and school projects. For years, Daniel had quietly trained himself not to think about this house. Tonight, every ordinary detail felt priceless. His eye settled on the framed photograph of Margaret. She was smiling at the camera, one arm around a teenage Daniel while Samuel stood beside them with his hand resting proudly on his son's shoulder. Daniel walked over and picked up the frame. "I remember this day," he said softly. Samuel nodded. "Your high school graduation. I complained about wearing that cap. You said it made your hair look ridiculous." A faint smile appeared on both their faces. It lasted only a moment. Daniel traced the edge of the frame with his thumb. "I spent so much time trying to become someone important." His voice grew quieter, that I started treating where I came from like something I needed to erase. Samuel listened without interrupting. No advice, no judgment, just attention. "I kept telling myself it wasn't personal," Daniel continued. "I thought if people only saw the executive, the leader, the polished version of me." He stopped and shook his head. "They'd respect me more." Samuel finally spoke. "Did they?" Daniel thought about the applause, the interviews, the promotions, the award now sitting forgotten in the back seat of his car. "They respected what I accomplished." He looked directly at his father. "I'm not sure they knew who I was." The room fell quiet again, not uncomfortable, reflective. Samuel walked to the stove and placed a kettle on the burner. "Tea?" he asked. Daniel blinked. After everything that had happened, his father was offering him tea. "I'd like that." While the water heated, neither man rushed to fill the silence. The familiar whistle finally echoed through the kitchen. Samuel poured 2 cups exactly as he always had. One with a little sugar, one without. He placed the sweeter cup in front of Daniel. Daniel stared at it. "You still remembered?" Samuel smiled gently. "You've always taken your tea that way." Daniel wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "So many people know what title I have." His voice trembled slightly. "And you still remember how I drink my tea?" Samuel looked at him kindly. "That's what parents do." Daniel lowered his head. The sentence struck him harder than the acceptance speech ever had. He took a slow breath. "Dad." It was the first time he had spoken that word since arriving. "I need to tell you something without asking you to make it easier." Samuel nodded once. "I'm listening." Daniel's eyes filled with quiet remorse. "When I sent that message, I wasn't ashamed of the man you are." He paused. "I was ashamed that someone might connect me to the life I came from." The confession hung in the air. No excuses followed. No attempt to soften it. "I convinced myself that success meant becoming someone new." He looked around the room again. "But success didn't change my name." His voice broke. "It changed my courage." Samuel absorbed every word. He understood now what had stolen his son's gratitude. Not hatred, not cruelty. Fear. Fear dressed as ambition. Fear disguised as professionalism. Fear that had slowly become stronger than identity. Samuel reached across the table and rested his weathered hand over Daniel's. Not to erase the hurt. Not to end the conversation, simply to let his son know he wasn't facing the truth alone. "You made a painful choice," Samuel said quietly. "But that choice doesn't have to become the rest of your life." Daniel looked up. Hope appeared not because he had been forgiven, but because forgiveness had not been declared impossible. Outside, the porch light glowed against the darkened street. Inside, father and son sat at the same kitchen table where homework had once been finished, birthdays had been celebrated, and dreams had first been spoken aloud. The award remained miles away, forgotten in a parked car. For the first time that day, neither of them cared where it was. Something far more valuable had finally found its way home. Morning arrived gently. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen table where 2 empty teacups still sat side by side. Neither Samuel nor Daniel had slept much. Not because there was more to argue about. Because healing rarely arrives all at once. It settles quietly, asking people to live differently the next morning than they did the day before. Daniel stood at the sink, rinsing the cups. It felt strangely familiar. As a teenager, his father had insisted that whoever wasn't cooking helped clean up. For years, he had forgotten that simple rule. Now his hands remembered before his mind did. Samuel watched from the doorway with a faint smile. You still leave too much soap in the cups. Daniel looked over his shoulder and laughed. I guess some habits survive success. And some survive 40 years. The laughter faded into comfortable silence. It wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore. It was the silence of two people no longer afraid to share the same room. After breakfast, Daniel walked out to his car. The crystal award rested on the back seat inside its velvet case. He opened the door and looked at it for several moments. Just yesterday, it had felt like the destination. Now it looked different. Still beautiful, still meaningful, but no longer complete by itself. He carried the award into the house. Samuel looked up in surprise. I almost forgot that thing. Daniel smiled softly. I didn't. He placed the trophy on the kitchen table between them. For years, Daniel had imagined this moment. He had pictured his father admiring it, congratulating him, maybe even holding it for a photograph. Instead, he gently turned the award towards Samuel. I know my name is engraved on it. He paused. But this doesn't belong to me alone. Samuel immediately shook his head. No, son, it does. You earned it. Daniel looked directly into his father's eyes. I earned the promotion. I earned the title. I earned the recognition. He rested his hand lightly on the crystal. But I never could have earned any of those things without the man who worked weekends so I could study, without the man who skipped buying himself new boots so I could buy textbooks, without the man who never once made me feel guilty for dreaming bigger than our town. Samuel looked down quietly. Compliments had never made him comfortable. Gratitude made him even less so. I spent years accepting congratulations, Daniel continued, and I never stopped to ask who paid the first part of the price. Samuel's eyes glistened, not from pride, from relief. Not relief that his son had praised him, relief that his son finally saw him. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove back to the city, not to return to business as usual, to finish something he should have done long ago. The executive offices burst with conversation as he entered. Co-workers immediately gathered around. Congratulations, you were incredible last night. We loved your speech. Daniel thanked each of them sincerely. Then Michael approached. You disappeared before the reception. I had somewhere more important to be. Michael smiled knowingly. You found your father. I did. And? Daniel looked toward the large windows overlooking the city. I spent years believing success meant climbing higher. He smiled to himself. It turns out it also means knowing who deserves to climb the stairs with you. Michael nodded. Without another word, Daniel reached into his briefcase. He removed a framed photograph, the same high school graduation picture that had sat for years in Samuel's living room. He had quietly asked to borrow it that morning. He placed it on the bookshelf in his office, not hidden in a drawer, not turned toward the wall, right beside the awards and professional certificates. Anyone who entered would see it immediately. No explanation, no announcement, no performance, just the truth. A young man standing proudly between the two people who had given him everything. As Daniel stepped back and looked at the photograph, he realized he wasn't changing his public image. He was restoring his real one. And miles away, Samuel looked out from his front porch with a peace that had nothing to do with ceremonies or trophies. For the first time in many years, he no longer wondered whether he had been enough. He already knew the answer. His worth had never depended on being introduced as someone's father. It had always been proven by living as one. The next morning, the house felt different. Not because the pain had disappeared, because honesty had finally entered where silence had lived. Sunlight spread across the kitchen table, warming two empty teacups that neither Samuel nor Daniel had remembered to wash the night before. Healing had begun, not with dramatic promises, not with instant forgiveness, but with truth. Daniel stood at the sink, rinsing the cups. Samuel watched with an amused smile. You still use too much soap. Daniel laughed. And you still notice everything. I've had a lot of practice. For the first time in years, their laughter belonged to the same room, not to old memories, to the present. Later that morning, Daniel walked to his car. The crystal award rested inside its velvet case on the back seat. Yesterday, it had represented everything he had worked for. Today, it looked surprisingly small. He carried it into the house and placed it gently on the kitchen table. Samuel looked at it for a moment before looking back at his son. You finally brought it home. Daniel nodded. But not for the reason I thought I would. He slowly turned the trophy so Samuel could read the engraved name. My name is on it. He paused. But your fingerprints are all over it. Samuel lowered his eyes. He had never been comfortable receiving praise. I worked hard because I loved you, he said quietly. You don't owe me anything. Daniel shook his head. I know. Gratitude isn't something I owe. It's something I forgot. His voice trembled. I spent years chasing respect from strangers, while taking for granted the man who had already given it to me. Samuel reached out and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. You can't change yesterday. Daniel nodded. No, but I can decide who I am tomorrow. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the office. Congratulations echoed through every hallway. Co-workers shook his hand. Executives praised his speech. Reporters requested interviews. For the first time, none of it mattered more than the decision he had already made. He walked into his office. The walls displayed awards, certificates, and framed magazine covers. Then he opened his briefcase. Inside was the graduation photograph of himself standing proudly between Samuel and Margaret. He placed it in the center of the bookshelf, not behind the awards, beside them. Anyone entering his office would now see the people who made every achievement possible. Michael walked in a few minutes later. He noticed the photograph immediately. A warm smile crossed his face. So, Daniel smiled back. I finally stopped editing my own story. Michael looked at the picture once more before quietly saying, That's the most important thing in this office. Daniel believed him. Weeks later, Samuel and Daniel returned to the lake where Samuel had spent the afternoon of the ceremony. This time, they sat on the same bench. Neither spoke for several minutes. They didn't need to. Some conversations are finished with words. Others are finished with presence. A father and son watched the water ripple beneath the afternoon sun. Nearby, a little boy raced ahead before stopping to wait for his father. Samuel smiled. Daniel noticed. What were you thinking? Samuel looked toward the child. That no matter how far children run, they still need to know where home is. Daniel quietly nodded. Then, after a long silence, he said the words Samuel had never expected to hear. I am proud to be your son. Samuel turned toward him. No speech, no dramatic embrace, just two simple words. So am I. The award eventually found a place on Daniel's office shelf, but visitors rarely asked about it. They asked about the photograph beside it, and every single time, Daniel smiled before answering. That's the man who made all of this possible. Some achievements earn applause, some sacrifices shape lives, and in the end, the sacrifices are remembered long after the applause fades. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to call or visit someone who helped shape your life. Sometimes the words we keep waiting to say become the words we wish we'd spoken sooner. And if you believe stories about family, forgiveness, and second chances deserve to be told, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Because awards recognize accomplishments, but family remembers sacrifices.